I am the executive director of the Society for the Rule of Law, which is hosting this event tonight. Very excited to see you all. I'm glad some of you got cocktails next door, so you know there will be another opportunity to wet your whistle after the event. The bar will open again. We could enjoy some fellowship for half an hour when we're through with the substance of the evening. Just a few words before we get started about who we are, why we're here. For those of you who don't know us, the Society for the Rule of Law is an organization of predominantly conservative, libertarian, center-right lawyers and others who prioritize the defense of the rule of law, the Constitution, and the American experiment against all threats, whether they arise on the left or the right of the political spectrum. We are a membership organization. Our programming is made possible by and through our members. If our mission resonates with you, I hope you'll consider joining the society. You could go to our website, which is the societyfortheruleoflaw.org. There are a variety of levels of membership for lawyers, law students, normal people as well. Pick whichever one applies to you. We'd love to have you. I think if you've noticed in the last few days, last few weeks, there's been a fair amount of legal news. And there have been a lot of reactions and overreactions and worse in response to that news. I think these days demonstrate more than ever how important the work we are doing together is. And please, I hope you'll join us. We do many things at the Society, but at the heart of our work is our programming, where we are building this community and advancing the ideas that we all share. We do live programming like this fantastic event tonight. Our next live program will be on June 20th, and that's going to be a reception for summer associates. It'll be our first annual reception to connect with law students in the DC area and talk about the future of the conservative legal movement and our country. If you are or know a law student, please send them our way. We would love to have them and to meet them in a couple of weeks. We also do a regular series of substantive webinars. These are about bi-weekly, where we talk about legal issues that are relevant to our core mission. The best way to stay up to date on our programming, which we're constantly announcing new programming, is to, again, go to our website or follow us on social media. We're on Twitter, we are on LinkedIn, and we are on YouTube. Speaking of YouTube, tonight's event is being recorded. It is on the record, open to press, so keep that in mind. At the end of the substantive program, we will have hopefully at least 20 minutes to get questions from the audience. So as you're listening to these two fantastic presenters this evening, please do think about questions you would like to ask. With that, I'll say a few words about each of them. I'll be brief. They are both very impressive gentlemen. Peter Keisler is the former acting Attorney General of the United States. He's also the former Assistant Attorney General for the Civil Division, which he led in the George W. Bush administration. He's also, importantly to us and to tonight, a founding member and advisory board member for the Society for the Rule of Law. Our featured guest is Dr. Robert Kagan. He is the Stephen and Barbara Friedman Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution and a contributing columnist to the Washington Post. He previously served in government, in the State Department, on the policy planning staff under Secretary of State George P. Shultz. His ideas and his writings have been influential in Washington and beyond for many, many years. It's no surprise that Politico magazine named him one of the thinkers, doers, and visionaries transforming American politics. We are very, very fortunate to have him with us this evening. Dr. Kagan is a prolific writer. He seems to have a book out every year. His newest one is called Rebellion: How Antiliberalism is Tearing America Apart Again. And that book, I think, will be the foundation of our discussion today. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Peter and Dr. Kagan. Thank you, gentlemen.
Greg said, we will leave plenty of time for questions, so if you have any, please keep them in mind, because we'd really like to open this up with at least 20 or 30 minutes of questions if people have them. So let me just say, as I told Bob, it's a great book. I really enjoyed reading it, and I learned a lot from it, and those are the two things I'd want from any book, or at least the things I most want. So let me just start out. The first word in the title is rebellion. Who is it that is in a state of rebellion, in your view, and what is it they are rebelling against?
Well, thank Peter, and thank you all for being here, and thanks for inviting me. I appreciate it. Oops, sorry. I have a very loud voice. I really don't think I need this, but I'm sure. Beautiful. Thank you very much. Anyway, just to repeat, thank you all for being here. It's a real pleasure for me. I know you're here because you're concerned about the things that that are right to be concerned about, and I appreciate your involvement. One of the things that I think is just missing is just citizen activism right now. If it were property taxes, everybody'd be up in arms. But if it's just democracy, Anyway, who is rebelling? The Trump movement is rebelling, and I think that what I would say the core point that I'm trying to make in this book is, this is not just a disagreement over policy. This is not the usual back and forth of politics, although there are certainly elements of that. People are behaving as if things are normal politics as usual. But this really is a struggle over the definition of the country. And it is not a new struggle. And one of the core arguments of this book is that there have been opponents of the basic premises of our country and system from the very beginning, and those basic premises is articulated in the Declaration of Independence, and is the true essence of what liberalism is about. Liberalism is about the protection of individual rights. It has a lot of other connotations and a lot of other baggage that it carries, but at its core, that's what it's about. And I think we have to understand that from the beginning of the Republic, there have always been people who rejected that notion. Certainly the slaveholding South was not only acting in rejection, but also believed and said that the statements about equality should never have been put in the Declaration of Independence, that equality was absurd. To talk about human equality was absurd. And after the Civil War, obviously during Reconstruction, and after Reconstruction, even past the Civil Rights era. So, I think because we're all sort of children of the Enlightenment, that there's such a thing as progress, and particularly human progress and human improvement. And I think that, unfortunately, history keeps showing us that there really isn't. And you would expect, 100 years after the end of slavery, that people would have accepted the end of white supremacy, but they didn't. And here we are 60, 70 years later, and many, many people still haven't. And I do believe that although there's many things going on that have caused people to be disgruntled and dissatisfied with the government and the way it operates, I really do think that at the core of this, it's not the only issue, but it definitely, for me, is the core of issue is race. This is very much about white supremacy. The Trump movement is about white supremacy. Sometimes it's also about Christian nationalism, but Christian nationalism and white supremacy are very closely related. Trump introduced himself as a white supremacist in 2011 when he ran on a single issue, which was birtherism. He is running now on a platform of white supremacy with his Poison the Blood campaign. And so that's the rebellion. The rebellion is against a system of equality, a system without either racial or religious hierarchies. Liberalism is to some extent destructive of certain hierarchies and traditions, and people just have to accept that if they want to live in a liberal order. But I really think that many people do not want to live in a liberal order, and that this is what the fight is about. And in some respects, and I'm going to shut up in 1 second, I think that they may feel, and rightly so, that this is their last chance, because the demographics are against them. This is not going to be a white Protestant country. It's not a white Protestant majority. It's not going to be a white majority pretty soon. And I think that, over time, the demographics are going to swamp this rebellion. But right now, with Donald Trump as the nominee, and And for reasons that we can get into, so many Republicans who I don't think are particularly white supremacists, nevertheless going along with the core of this movement, we really do face the prospect of a government run by people who are fundamentally opposed to the founders' system. And so, I'm sorry, that's a long explanation,
No,
but
that's great, and we can spend the next 40 minutes unpacking lots of that.
Terrific.
So you don't say illiberal, you say anti-liberal, which I took to embody the fact that you see kind of an organized, aggressive, energetic effort, not simply devoid of liberal sensibilities, but seeking to supplant kind of the existing order. Is that right?
Right, and partly well, first of all, illiberalism sounds like something you might do by accident, and I want to be clear that we're not we're anti-liberal, not just illiberal, and in a way I want to give, first of all, I think spell out what the stakes are. I do think that people are ideologically predisposed against liberalism, and you have to take that seriously. And I want to put ideas back in the struggle. We treat the American people as if, well, if you give them money, they're happy. If they don't have money, they're unhappy. If you take care of this problem, they're happy. If you don't take care of that problem, they're unhappy. And we have a very materialistic understanding, which is quite at odds with reality. I think most of the complaints of people in the Trump side are fundamentally not economic. They are with the way the system operates in ways that they think is disadvantaging them.
Yeah. So your description of liberalism, it's a lot about individual rights and equality. You mentioned democracy at the very beginning. Democracy is at stake, but it wasn't actually part of your discussion of what liberalism is. Is that, to you, a separate concept? Is it all wrapped up together?
It's definitely a separate concept. I think you can argue, and I think it's correct, that you probably cannot have liberalism without democracy. Long ago, a couple of decades ago, people like Fareed Zakaria talked about liberal autocracy and illiberal democracy, and these are interesting concepts, but I don't think you really do need democracy to have liberalism. But democracy is not liberalism itself, and the founders were very aware that democracy was not necessarily, could not necessarily be trusted to protect individual rights. The majority could trample on minority rights. That was their experience in dealing with the British Parliament, after all. And so they knew that, well, first of all, we have to understand their theory of government, their theory of natural rights, which is that these rights are inherent, that people are born, that you're born with them, that they are not given by government. They're not even given by the Constitution. The Constitution just exists to protect them. And they also need to be protected from democracy. And that was what the founders saw clearly. That was part of their complaint with the Articles of Confederation. That's why they built a stronger federal government, in part to ensure that the states would ultimately also enforce the rights that the federal government thought was important. So democracy, I think, as I say, is essential to liberalism, but it's not the same as liberalism.
And let me just start a third concept, which is often said in the same breath, which is rule of law. Where does that fit in? And actually, let me invite you, obviously your book came out before the events of the last week and the conviction in New York, to say anything you'd like to say about that.
Well, I'm not, to say that I'm not a lawyer is one of the great understatements of all time. I'm not a legal scholar. I haven't studied the law, etc. I haven't even played one on TV. So I just keep that in mind. But obviously, the issue of whether people are above or not above the law is a critical element of liberalism, because you're not going to have a liberal society if some people are above the law. They're going to impose their will on others and deprive others of their rights. So obviously the rule of law is critical. This case, this verdict, to me it's a little complicated and potentially a distraction. I guess that's my, I don't think that this problem was meant to be addressed in the courts. The founders definitely did not intend for the problem of having a potential tyrant, which is the problem we're dealing with. And I think it's important to keep our eye on that fact. The problem with Donald Trump is not that he violated federal election laws and attempted to cover it up, although that is a problem. But that is not why he should not be president. He should not be president because he's a would-be tyrant. And would-be tyrants were not meant to be brought to court. They were meant to be impeached. That was the remedy that the founders offered us. That is the remedy that Republicans, I think in retrospect, even for some of them, quite foolishly passed up. And therefore, we are very much in a second best realm when we're talking about courts. And I worry that if what we've done here in this case to some extent is get Al Capone on tax cheating, let's not forget what our real beef with Al Capone is, and it's not that he cheated on his taxes. So, I feel like I am a little concerned that now we're going to have a whole discussion about how significant this particular verdict is, when what we really need to be continuing to talk about is the fact that Donald Trump is a clear and present danger to our democracy, irrespective of this court case.
Well, when one thinks about anti-liberalism in the way you mean it, if we're talking about individual rights, certainly somebody, and equal individual rights for everyone, if that's the concept, certainly someone who calls his opponents vermin and says migrants aren't really even people, that's just denying the essential personhood, which is the predicate for the sense. If you talk about democracy, you've of course got January 6th. I will say this about the rule of law and the trial that we've just seen, which is that what was most striking to me, put aside the merits of, was this properly a felony under New York law? What did the evidence show? How good was the charging decision or not? What was striking to me was how incapable Donald Trump was of conducting himself within the confines of a courtroom the way like any criminal defendant would want to be able to conduct themselves. I mean, it sucks to be a criminal defendant. Nobody likes it. But normally, most people are able to sit there without falling asleep or scowling or muttering so audibly under their breath when a ruling goes against them or a witness says something they don't like, that the judge has to admonish them. And putting aside everything he said outside, which was obviously somewhat strategic, I just think showing submission, showing respect for that process was something he was incapable of doing, at least without kind of breaking the bond he has with his supporters. And I think all of those things just show how antithetical his whole persona is to the system you described. So let me ask you something. There is something I feel I have heard countless politicians say, and they usually say it at rallies or at conventions, and they start out by saying, there are many things we as Americans may disagree about. But then, their voice gets lower and they slow down for emphasis and they say, but those things pale in comparison to the fundamental things that unite us as Americans, the ideals of the founding. I take it you don't buy any of that.
I'm afraid I can't. I think the evidence suggests that the idea that we all agree on these fundamental premises is just not. It's not historically accurate. It has never been true, and it's not. And then shockingly, it's not true now. I think shockingly because I think most of us assume that by now we'd all be down with it, since we've had a civil rights revolution and we've been perfecting the system as Lincoln hoped we would. But I would say what's happened is the more that liberalism, the founders' liberalism, the more it has done what Lincoln said, which is to deepen and broaden in society constantly, the more it has been successful, the more certain groups feel oppressed by it. And I do think we need to recognize that they feel oppressed by liberalism because it is creating a country that is not the country they want to live in. And so, that they are, I think that this is in a way, this is my concern, is that too many Americans don't realize that we're having our civil conflict right now. We're sort of waiting for the civil conflict. Aren't we having it right now? I mean, getting back to the court case again, I couldn't be less surprised about Donald Trump's behavior in the court. I actually predicted much worse. I thought he would go out of his way to demonstrate that the court had no control over him. It turns out, I think, that he is personally, physically afraid of the idea of being in jail. Otherwise, I would have said the best thing for him to do would have been to be thrown in jail from his point of view. But he didn't want to be that kind of martyr, which is an interesting thing to keep in mind. But so Trump's behavior didn't really surprise me. And this is what I'm about to say doesn't surprise me either, but I think it's much more important. It wouldn't have mattered what the case was. Trump supporters would have said that the trial was illegitimate, that the decision was illegitimate. And the fact that we're having a little argument, the Wall Street Journal editorial page wants to cleverly parse whether this was a good case or not case. What difference would it have made? If it was the best case in the world on the most important issue, would then they have said, oh, okay, fine. So, in a certain sense, by the way, and we can get into this, this whole argument is not a fair argument. One side is completely disingenuous and dishonest, and the other side is trying to find its way through a complicated moral thicket. The other one is not having that problem.
And you kind of draw a straight line from the founding to the current day with this movement, right? And your point is, this has always been with us in some form or another. It was with us with the Birchers, it was with us with the anti-immigrant policies in the 1920s, the Civil War, the Reconstruction, the founding. It's all the same thing?
Look, there has always been two definitions of America, and one of them is correct and one of them is incorrect, but nevertheless extremely popular. There has always been an ethno-religious definition of America. Many, many, many white Protestant Americans have always believed that America was a white Protestant country founded by white Protestants for white Protestants. Now, you would think, again, that maybe we'd be over this by now, but clearly we're not. And so, that is just, they do not agree that this is a country that is founded on the principles of the Declaration and, for equal rights, and that anybody can be a citizen, anyone is an American. They continue to view being an American in a certain ethno-religious fashion, and their patriotism, is to the wrong country, basically. This is a point, I think, that Tim Alberta has made very well, this kind of fetishization of America as sort of God's country in a literal sense, but the God's country that they're talking about is a white Christian God. And that's what they feel patriotic toward, not to this, I would say, relative miracle of a system based on the idea of human equality.
So you've centered a lot of this, you talked about white supremacy earlier. Trump was the first birther of any prominence. Some of that feels at least incomplete to me. I mean, it's undeniable that race is a huge part of this. There are reasons Confederate flags were hoisted on January 6th. But, you also see a lot of things that look very similar happening in a lot of other countries around the world that don't have our tortured history on race. You see, for whatever reason, at least some polls, and it may be contested, showing that Trump is doing better among black and Hispanic voters than other Republicans did, 8 and more years ago. Do you think there are other pieces of the explanation that also have explanatory power, or does it really all come back to race?
What I want to say is the driving force, the white hot core, if you will, of this movement is about race. And I obviously there are other issues playing a role, and obviously there are other factors for each individual, but this movement at its core is about race and religion. And so I think that's right. But that cannot, as you say, explain everybody who right now is saying they would support Trump. I have been hearing about the polls on minorities for, can we just wait for the vote? I don't know what these polls mean right now. And by the way, George W. Bush got something like 45% of the Latino vote, as I recall, the Hispanic vote. Why? Because he was pro-immigration. And now, I don't think that Trump has anything like those numbers, but obviously their motivation is different. And this gets to a core point, another point, which I think is important, which is, it's particularly true, I think, of white Republicans who are not necessarily white supremacists, but are white Republicans, but also it seems to be true of minorities, and it certainly is true of immigrant groups that have basically gotten to the point where they feel that they've made it in America, that they're safe in America. The one thing I think history shows us is that those who have the most need for liberalism are the most passionate about liberalism, which is to say, immigrants who come to the country who are treated with disdain by the home population, the native population, if you will, which you can't really say in America, use liberalism, use the Bill of Rights, use the the system of our country to get themselves to a position where their rights are respected, and then when they are respected. But once they've gotten to that point, and they're in a sense, and I'm talking about white immigrants in particular, they're now part of the white family, and they no longer need liberalism, they feel. And I think that that explains a lot of the migration from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party of what we used to call the Reagan Democrats. Now, part of it is changing economic circumstances, but I think a lot of it is they just don't need it anymore. They don't need to worry about their rights, and therefore they're not worried about rights in general. I think that could be true about a lot of groups, including minorities. Now, in my view, you have to be very unaware of what Trump represents to think that you're going to be okay in that system. My problem my biggest concern is that many white Republicans who are not, as I say, racist, who are not, white supremacists, nevertheless feel like they're going to be okay in a Trump administration, almost regardless of what happens. And my favorite person on this regard, now this has got a special element to it, but it still is Jamie Dimon, who said, with his comments at Davos about how basically, well, Trump was sort of right about immigration, Trump was sort of right about NATO. Those lines don't look too good in retrospect right now. But what he was basically saying was, I'm good either way. And more particularly, my company's good either way. But also, I'm good either way. And I think that Jamie Dimon, he's right. He is good either way. He's going to be fine, even if it is a Trump dictatorship, because he's got billions of dollars and he's a white man. Now, so I think, unfortunately, there are a lot of people who just feel like, it's not that big a deal. And this is something that Thomas Jefferson warned about, that Lincoln warned about, that, the country is, liberalism and having a society based on liberalism is unique in human history. It is the hardest thing to do. And in some ways, liberalism is contrary to human nature. Human nature is about family and tribe and sticking with your own. That is a big part of human nature. And telling people that they not only need to look out for their own rights, but look out for the rights of people who don't look like them, don't talk like them, don't believe in the religion they believe in, et cetera, et cetera. That's a hard thing to pull off. That's what this country managed to pull off. But it's a lot to ask people. And I think that too many Americans at this stage, just as Lincoln lamented it in 1838 in his Lyceum speech, just as Thomas Jefferson warned in his notes on the state of Virginia in 1781, that the people have just lost their passion for freedom, for passion for liberties, their passion for equality. And they're just not willing to fight for it anymore. So now they're interested in their selfish interests. They are interested in tax breaks. They're interested in getting those people over there to shut up because they're making too much noise and I don't want to have to see them. And that is enough to get them to vote for somebody who may well completely overturn the system. And to me, therefore, at the end of the day, I don't have to say, why did that particular person decide that he's going to vote for Trump or she's going to vote for Trump? I don't have to decide that. What I can decide is, in doing so, you have lost your interest in defending the principles of this country, that this country was founded on. That's the one thing I can say with confidence.
And in terms of his appeal, you don't, I think, see the economic stuff as terribly relevant. I mean, Trump broke with his predecessors on the Republican side on tariffs. He's, banished talk about entitlement reform. No one talks about a balanced budget anymore. He's really charted a different direction. There are at least some people who say, well, that's helping him with the working class vote. And I take it that you don't think that really is, you think that's peripheral.
I do. And anyone who thinks that the working man's savior economically is Donald Trump is really, smoking something, because everybody knows what Donald Trump's economic program is going to be, and that's why the Jamie Dimons of this world and the Stephen Schwartzmans of this world are donating money to him or supporting him publicly in one way or another. We know he's going around promising oil companies what he's going to give them if they give him money. I mean, the notion that Trump in any way is concerned about the working class is absurd. And just going back to the 2016 election, it is perfectly true that people of a certain income and education level, if they were white, voted overwhelmingly for Trump. If they were not white, in that income level and in that educational level, they voted for Hillary Clinton. You know, it isn't simply the case that the working class feels a certain way. I mean, honestly, it's very typical of American liberals, but I guess it's typical of America in general to constantly be looking for economic and class explanations for things that are about race. And you asked me about Europe and other places where anti-liberalism or illiberalism is flourishing. The first thing to be said about that is it goes back to what I said before. Liberalism is hard, and it's always going to have opponents. It's had opponents since it was born, because it is contrary to all kinds of traditional ways of doing things. But also in Europe, the cause is similar. It's immigration. You know, it was 100,000 Syrians in Germany. It was, or more than that. The countries that have no immigration are panicked about immigration, which is similar to here, where states where there is no immigration, nevertheless, people claim to be worried about immigration. And so I do think that they're the same roots, but it's important to understand that America has a specific history that is very much our own, and especially on the race question, which is a unique American problem.
Let me ask you this. You're a scholar of many things, but you're, among other things, an especially deep scholar of foreign affairs and foreign relations. There wasn't a mention of it in the book, which must have required a lot of discipline on your part. And I take it because you don't think that's really the fault line here on which. But it is interesting that, like, the MAGA movement hates aid to Ukraine, can't even rhetorically express sympathy there. They've resurrected America First. What do you think that's about, and how does that relate to the other things that you have talked about with respect to?
Well, if you read my foreign policy books, you'll see that, and this is, I think, particularly true of America, although it may be true of other countries as well, that there's no separating us, for Americans, the domestic ideological battle with the foreign policy battle. Our foreign policy battles, from the time of Jefferson and Hamilton, have always been primarily about domestic issues, because they're about how do we define ourselves as Americans. And I think that's true of our entry into World War I and World War II, et cetera. We could go all the way through it. But in the current situation, if you read what people like Josh Hawley and others, what Elbert Colby and others have written about why Ukraine somehow should not be the place that we support, it's inextricably tied up to their war on liberalism in general. That, just as, by the way, isolationists and conservative Republicans in the World War II period referred, during the war even, to America's entry into World War II as the New Dealers' War. The Ukraine aid is seen as a liberal war. And by the way, they're right. It is ultimately, the reason Americans care about Ukraine is ultimately because of liberalism, because of the fear that liberalism would be at threat in Europe. We don't have any vital security interests of our own in Ukraine. It is about defending the liberal order in Europe. And that is exactly what these people are opposed to. If Trump gets to be in office again, he will continue where he started in his first term. He's going to link up with all the far-right movements in Europe. He loves Farage. He loves Le Pen. He's going to be in favor of the AfD in Germany. That is going to be the common cause, because that will be the anti-liberal alliance with the United States at the head of it. It's a frightening and really, in some ways, nauseating thought. But nevertheless, I do believe Ukraine is about this fight. And China is sucked into this fight as well, because look at what they say about Biden. We don't take this stuff seriously. It sounds so ridiculous. This is why we don't take it seriously. It's time we need to start listening to what these people are saying. Joe Biden is a communist. The administration is a communist regime. Therefore, it is soft on, at least, and friendly to, at most, the Chinese Communist Party. If you don't doubt that Republicans say this all the time, I will send you 50 quotations along these lines. And which, by the way, is also what they were saying in the 1930s, that FDR was a communist who was pro-Soviet, and they saw Nazi Germany and Mussolini as checks on communism. And so, we shouldn't be, we're shocked because we can't believe people say these things, but this is what happens. This is what we were like before World War II, and here we are again.
And President Trump, wouldn't lift a finger if Taiwan were invaded, would he? I mean,
I have a very hard time it's funny, I think it's easier to predict his domestic behavior than his foreign behavior, just because foreign policy has got so many ways it bounces off. Do I think he cares about Taiwan? No. But if it made him look weak and bad that he didn't do anything about Taiwan, so who knows? By the way, I don't think the Chinese are looking to invade Taiwan. That's another subject. But if they did, I think Trump, first of all, is not hawkish. I think his base wants non-involvement. But it's interesting how he responded to losing on the Ukraine vote. He clearly was outnumbered in the party on that one issue, which is, to me, very interesting. It was the one issue Republicans were willing to buck Trump on. Which indicates to me that even Republicans are not ready to give up the American role in the world quite yet. And so I think Trump might be a little bit constrained by a country that is not interested in getting into other conflicts, but also is not interested in not being, America in the world anymore.
So could you situate Donald Trump against his predecessors on the Republican side, both, the presidents and the presidential candidates? I understood from your book that both George Bush's, Dole, McCain, Romney, they're all what you would call liberal conservatives, right. People who hold a conservative political program but support liberalism. I wasn't quite sure. I mean, you had a much more complex and nuanced analysis of Ronald Reagan. Could you talk about how you see Reagan?
Yeah, I see Reagan as basically a liberal conservative in the sense of, it's the Harvey Mansfield, he certainly didn't invent it, but it's the Harvey Mansfield definition of conservatism, which is conservatives are there to protect liberalism from liberals. I used to think that was truer. I'm not sure I believe that conservatives are actually engaged in that anymore, but in any case, Reagan was definitely fundamentally, I think, a liberal in his outlook. He was it's worth remembering that as a young man, not as a child, but as a young man, he was an FDR Democrat. He was that old. And, he was a labor leader in Hollywood, if you can believe that, et cetera, et cetera. Then, of course, he shifted in his time at the governorship of California, and he made himself a movement conservative. But I don't think that he ever was what was an anti-liberal conservative. But he certainly brought a coalition into power which included significant anti-liberals who had not been in power since the 1920s. Because really, in the every administration from Eisenhower to Nixon to obviously if Dole had won, but Bush, the two Bushes, were fundamentally liberal in their orientation, and particularly particularly on the immigration question. He said things which he would be ridden out of the party for now. But Trump is something different, and so I think Trump really represents. And throughout this period of Reagan, at the end of the Reagan term, the real hardcore conservatives, which is what we called them then, but which I want to call the anti-liberal conservatives, they felt like they'd been screwed. They didn't get what they wanted out of the Reagan administration. Least of all, when the next person up for presidency is George H.W. Bush, who might as well be Nelson Rockefeller as far as they're concerned. So they felt like they were losing and got into this mode of looking at the two parties, as Josh Hawley now calls it, as the uniparty, that there's really no difference between the two of them. And in some respects, they were right, because both were preserving liberalism. This began to shift, I believe, in the Republican Party. The most obvious moment when you could actually measure its shift was in was in the 2012 election, where nomination. I mean, Romney won the battle, but his competitors tended to be more anti-liberal. And then in 2016, look what happened to all the then liberal conservative candidates: Marco Rubio, Jeb Bush, John Kasich. What did they get? A collective 15% of the vote or something? I don't even remember. Whereas there were all kinds of, it wasn't just Donald Trump getting votes. There was Cruz. There were other various loonies that we don't even think about anymore. It was clear that a shift had occurred in the party where the anti-liberals were now in the ascendant.
Right.
And I think now why that is, I'm going to have to say, go read the book. I did the best job I could. It's not an easy thing to answer, and partly because the paradox is that even though it was, I think, it was a combination of the Obama victory and the appearance of Donald Trump in response to that victory that shifted so many people so dramatically. I think that the Obama presidency was a traumatic experience for a lot of white Americans, and lo and behold, here's a guy who comes along and, unlike all these liberal conservatives, says, hello, white supremacists over here, which is what he did in 2011. He introduced himself to the white supremacists and said, here I am. And they have understood ever since that he's their guy. So that was the shift that occurred in the party at that time.
Yeah, I remember what certain movement conservatives always said about Reagan was, let Reagan be Reagan.
Right.
Right? And the idea was Reagan was being held back by all the moderates around him, but his true self, was being throttled.
Right.
And but that kind of was a diplomatic way of expressing dissatisfaction.
Right. It was basically saying, let Reagan be me, let me, the hardcore conservative, because, of course, he'd made all kinds of compromises. And by the way, interesting distinction, Ronald Reagan was the most popular Republican president probably in history. Maybe Theodore Roosevelt was a comparison. And Ronald Reagan was not the conservatives were always unhappy with him. They weren't happy with him on foreign policy. They were unhappy with him on domestic policy. And they fought him and they bucked him, and now here you go. You've got Donald Trump. They can't buck him on anything. It's a real difference in the nature of leadership. And again, we haven't talked about fascism yet, but that's the other thing. It's not just that we have a different point of view. We have a very dramatically different style of leadership in Trump, and not so much because of Trump, but because of his following.
Yeah, let's talk about that. I mean,
Yeah.
you use the F word
Yeah.
in your book, which most people, or a lot of people shy away from because
Yeah.
it's so provocative. What are the parallels you see, and how is it different from what we think of as fascism?
Yeah, I mean, fascism is tricky because our fascist example is, if people aren't speaking German and don't have a funny mustache, then they're not fascists, at least in our discourse. But what is fascism? Fascism is the elevation of a single leader as being the source of all truth and the person who's going to lead the country forward away from the disaster. And it is something that exists only in a popular era, right? It is the answer to democracy in a sense, because in our modern era, what's the alternative to democracy? It's not monarchy. We're not going to establish monarchs in place of democracies. Any leader, including Vladimir Putin, including Xi Jinping, has to at least have the appearance that he speaks for the people, and that he really is representative in some way. And I think that is what you can have in a democracy if you're trying to subvert democracy. You have to subvert democracy by, in a way, using democracy to do it. And I don't care what you call it. If you don't want to call it fascism, call it something else. But at least let's identify it and understand what it is as distinct from normal politics. And I think this has been the hardest thing for all of us to get our heads wrapped around. It's why I think the media, which I don't criticize the media the way a lot of people do, because I think they've got they're in a tough situation. But it's very hard for them not to treat this as if you have Republicans and you have Democrats and they're having an argument. That's not really what's going on. You have a democratic culture that is being assaulted by a fascist movement. which doesn't believe in a democratic culture, which uses the laws only when they're useful to them and then goes outside the law when it's not. It's a movement that is simultaneously working within the system and outside the system. So in a way, we're all playing, roughly speaking, by the Marquis of Queensberry rules, and they are playing by the rules of a street fight. And I think that, if you poll street fighters and ask them what they think about the country, you're going to get the kind of answers that we're getting. I think our polls are distorted by this sort of this asymmetry between what is essentially a fascist movement on one side and a normal American democratic system on the other.
So you're using street fighters as a metaphor.
Yeah.
But let me talk
Not
about
totally, right?
Well, talk about violence for a moment, because
Yeah.
just thinking about the trial last week, Trump was on Fox, asked him what if you were put in under house arrest, and it was like, well, look, I could deal with that, but the people have a breaking point, and there's always been this undercurrent of threat, and sometimes it's not been an undercurrent, sometimes it's been quite explicit. I mean, is that part of the picture here?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the threat of violence is already playing a role in our politics. If you go back and read the McKay Coppins biography of Mitt Romney, Romney has a quotation in there about the members of Congress that he spoke to who were physically afraid of voting for impeachment because they feared that they would be attacked. Now, I think, unfortunately, this is the way it is when you're trying to fight for liberalism and freedom. There are risks that are associated with it, but there's no question that violence is in the air. And also, I think we can anticipate violence in the event of a Biden victory, but also as an increasing factor in our country if Trump wins. And it's worth remembering how much violence has always existed in our system. For most of our history, there was routine violence committed against blacks throughout the South, and the federal government's attitude was, we don't know anything about it. Now, we are not used to that now. Now, if there's violence, the federal government clearly is leaning in a certain direction. Whether you have Republicans or Democrats in office, you still have a fundamentally liberal approach to that. I don't think people realize that if Trump is in power and the kind of people that he's going to bring in, they don't have to do anything to create a major shift in the way we deal with a lot of local problems that include violence. They don't have to pursue cases against policemen. They don't have to criticize people who carry out violence of a political nature. They could applaud it. And so I think that, and it's clear that there are violent groups who are completely devoted to Trump, and by the way, therefore, in case you don't feel like your average citizen deserves to be called a fascist, they definitely deserve to be called fascists because they are violent movements who are ready to do the bidding of their leader. And so I think, violence is definitely in our future, unfortunately, and we're a heavily armed country.
And so, there's the passivity of letting violence happen by others, by private armies. There's also, a president controls the military, and there are a lot of strictures against using it for domestic law enforcement, but there are also a lot of loopholes in those strictures.
Yeah, and if you want to read a frightening book, read Miles Taylor's account of the things that Trump wanted to do in his term, which is Trump discovered what any president discovers, which is the one organization that he has total control of is the U.S. military. And so and he had an obvious tendency to want to use the military and also the Homeland Security operation as part of wielding power domestically in various different ways. He's not limited by traditions that say you shouldn't be overdoing it. We do have an Insurrection Act which he can call on if he wants to, and I don't think we can trust him to use it sparingly because he thinks it's an extreme thing to do. I think he will want to routinize the use of the military.
Let me ask you for a moment on a completely different topic about the Supreme Court. So 3 of the current members were appointed by presidents you would regard as liberal conservatives, Roberts, Alito, Thomas. The other 3 were appointed by Trump among the Republican appointees, but at least in my view, they could easily have been appointed by a Jeb Bush if he were president. and 2 of them were put on the Court of Appeals by George Bush. But you really don't like the current court, at least you don't like originalism. Can you talk about that some?
Yeah, and I mean, if you want to go back again to the ways in which Reagan did encourage anti-liberalism, his court appointments are certainly, not his court appointment. Who
Well, he put Scalia, O'Connor, and Kennedy,
right,
and he
Scalia,
nominated Bork unsuccessfully.
Right. I mean, I think well, so that gets to originalism. Here's the problem with originalism. And again, I am so out of, you're going to have to forgive me, all you lawyers out there. But to me, there is a sort of inherent problem with originalism, which is the founders themselves knew that their own behavior and the behavior of their society at the time was not in conformance with the principles that they had fought for and erected as the guiding principles of the government, which was the principles of the Declaration. So they knew that their practices were not the model that anyone should look to in order to find out what they meant, because what they meant was something that didn't yet exist even in their own society. They thought that slavery was a violation of the rights of blacks, and they just didn't feel they could do anything about it, and they hoped it would go away. So anyway, so if part of your answer to what do we do now is, well, let's go back and find out what they meant by these things at the time, or how they behaved at the time, much less go back to whatever 17th century cases some people have gone back to. That is to drain the search for a legal truth, to drain it of those liberal principles that the founders meant to build the system around. That's at least the way it looks to me.
Well, let me lay out briefly a counter view. I don't want to linger
Please,
over this.
No. I don't.
The counter view is, originalism is all about applying the founding principles, and not only the 1787 principles, but the Civil War amendments.
Yeah.
Those guys were founders too in the second founding, and all of its imperfections and inconsistencies are there, and they get applied too. But I think, all originalists today would say Brown was absolutely a correct originalist decision. But what they would probably say, and what we would probably say, is that the project of updating those principles to apply to more modern sensibilities as people's ideas change, that's a project for the democratic process rather than a project for the court. There's a lot that's contestable about that, but is it fundamentally illiberal?
It depends on it depends on what issue you're talking about. So, like even saying that, it's our modern sensibilities that we need to adjust to. I mean, that's one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it is they didn't realize at the time that by holding the prejudices that they held, they were in fact depriving a certain group. By the way, they did realize it about some groups, but they didn't realize it about the groups that they didn't realize it about, that they were in fact depriving them of their rights. So, for instance, the issue of gay marriage obviously did not come up, right? But it's not, in my view, an expansion of rights or an adjustment to modern sensibilities. It is merely the discovery that there is no reason to deny, there is no legitimate reason to deny these people those rights. And so all we've done is pulled away another layer of prejudice, in many cases religious prejudice, because of course that is what, the hostility to gay behavior is fundamentally religious. And so I don't think the founders would have thought twice if they were if they were transported to this situation and said, look, this is the situation you didn't understand could happen, but it has happened. And so therefore these people have been deprived of their rights. To me, what the court is doing is uncovering natural rights that have been denied, not redefining what rights mean. And when I talk to most conservative friends of mine, they always talk about, creating new rights. That's not what happened. What happened was discovering old rights that had been not respected. And so, to my mind, I guess that's my answer. Now, obviously, there are some areas where there is no natural right sort of answer to the question, and that's a different type of problem.
So let me ask you, we have this anti-liberal movement you've described, and at the pinnacle of it is this, celebrity playboy businessman from New York City. If before it happened, that would have seemed like an improbable profile. for the leader of this movement you describe. How did that come about? Why him?
Well, I mean, that's like, you could say that about, if you take any figure in history who changed history, you could say, why him? I mean,
Well, what qualities does he have that made him fit
right,
that?
That's the right question, because the truth is that Trump, in his basic sort of demagogic qualities, is very similar to a lot of past demagogues. This is something that I found interesting when I went back and was reading, for instance, about Joe McCarthy, or George Wallace, or Pitchfork Ben Tillman. They all had some things in common. One, boorish behavior, uncouth behavior, which people at the time recognized was effective, because the behavior itself symbolized what they represented for people, which was a wrecker of the system, someone who didn't respect the norms, didn't believe in, wasn't sort of seduced by this liberal ethos, and therefore clearly was the guy who was strong enough to sort of fight against it And Trump's, I think it was as important for Trump to disparage John McCain as anything else, because here was a situation where people felt like, well, I can't say anything bad about John McCain, and therefore I just have to take it when John McCain says that I'm wrong about something. And Trump said, no, you don't. You don't have to care about the fact that he's a war hero. You don't have to care about any of that. And that was very liberating for a lot of people. He gives people permission not to have to listen to it anymore. And I think it's therefore very much about the way he behaves is precisely what is attractive to them. What many of us find to be sort of appalling behavior for a politician, it's precisely the appalling nature that they find attractive.
But also, isn't it? I think that's absolutely right. But also, isn't it the fact that if he says those kinds of things, then they know he's pissed off their enemies so much he'll never be seduced by them. He will always, he's broken those bridges, he can be trusted.
That's true. I do think it's important to look at it from the way I think their perspective is, and this is something that I discovered reading focus group interviews by Sarah Longwell, which is those of us on the other side tend to think that they love, getting the liberals and insulting them, etc. And I'm sure that's true. But I think they also feel like he is taking all the attacks on him, that they see him as someone who is taking the attacks that are also meant for them, and he's the one who's absorbing the blows and fighting back. All these depictions of him as Superman, as some kind of muscle-bound hero, as Rambo, it's important to realize, I think these people feel that they are the ones under assault, that he is fighting that big, bad liberal establishment which controls the media, which controls the culture, which controls everything. And his toughness, his brutality in a way, is precisely what makes him the person who can resist those forces and fight back for us.
Well, and he says at his rallies, doesn't he?
Right.
I'm standing between them and you.
That's right.
They're coming after me because they want to get to you.
That's right. And whether they believe that or not, it doesn't matter. But I think that is definitely the ethos, that he is a champion against these evil forces.
So if it was just those people, he couldn't get an electoral vote majority, right? You mentioned Jamie Dimon. There's obviously another component to this. All these people who voted for the liberal conservatives in mostly the same numbers are voting for him. Is that because they don't see what you see? Is it because they see it and don't care? Is it because they see it and like it? What's the...
Well, I moved from option 1 to options 2 and 3. I mean, I used to believe that they didn't see it and they don't really believe it and all that kind of thing. And I ultimately have decided that is not possible. If you are a sentient American and you just see what he himself says and does every single day, there's enough reason not to say that it's a certainty that if he's elected that therefore we'll go into dictatorship, but that there is a greater risk than we have ever faced before. And so to look at that and say, I don't see it, I don't believe that. So therefore, I believe that part of them, I think my basic argument is the core of his movement wants that. They want to overthrow the system. They really do. I mean, I will never get over early on in my sort of thinking about this, that I saw that one of the women, somebody quoted who was present at January 6th, some 56-year-old woman from Indiana, I think. And she didn't go in. She was just on the outside. And they asked her, "What are you doing there?" She said, "We didn't come to cause any trouble. We didn't cause any damage. We just came to overthrow the government." And I think, look, can we just listen to them and accept that that is what they want? So I think that that is the heart of the movement. I think those are all the people like Stephen Miller and Steve Bannon and all those guys. I think they are like totally interested. The Heritage Foundation report, the Project 2025 stuff, I think it's pretty clear. So then how do you explain everybody else? I think the answer is they don't care. And certainly they don't care enough. They don't care enough to abandon Team R. They don't care enough to, look, and this is it's a real conundrum. If this were a normal election, I would not be voting for Joe Biden. I would not vote for Joe Biden in almost any normal election. So I understand why they don't want to vote for Joe Biden. I get that part of it. What I don't understand is why they don't see why, however bad Joe Biden is, this is infinitely worse. And you could say they don't see it, or they're okay with it. And I guess I'm increasingly, enough with the poor people don't understand. I think they understand. Let's take them seriously. Let's understand. And that's why I believe, let's face it, we're in a civil conflict. And the response, the thing on the trial that I think is more important than how Trump behaved or anything like that is how people are now saying, well, the hell with our justice system doesn't work. They're going to, they're going to discredit. It wasn't Bragg who messed up our justice system. It was Trump who messed up our justice system, but now they're saying, well, we're done with the justice system. And you can only imagine what they're going to say when he loses if and when he loses the election. So let's understand that we are in a real, there's no fighting right now, but this is a civil conflict. We have reached the point where I'm not sure what the discussion can be anymore.
And you said earlier, I mean, there are all these different ways of formulating a concept, which is the arc of history bends toward justice. We've reached the end of history, an ideological end state where we're not going to fight. You don't believe any of that either. I mean, you think we're balanced on a knife's edge at this point.
Yeah, I think if you look at the whole stretch of human history, liberalism is a blink of an eye. It is certainly not the norm, and I think that it is in fact an aberration based on the almost miracle of what the United States founding, which was not in any way inevitable. It is not inevitable progression of the Enlightenment. It is not inevitable progression of Anglo-Saxon. That's one of the things that I try to demonstrate in this book in passing, is that it isn't just a straight Anglo-Saxon culture that Americans then inherited. That's not what happened. England wasn't heading toward becoming a liberal democracy at the end of the 18th century, and neither were the American colonies for that matter. Before the revolution. So you have something that was it was a unique moment in history which created by circumstance an incredibly powerful nation, and like all powerful nations, it tended to support and spread its own way of looking at the things. You had a Greek world, you had a Roman world, and you've had an American world. But that doesn't mean that it lasts, and it has succeeded, I'm sorry, ultimately because of power. Because power was amassed on the side of liberalism, including in this country. I mean, if the Civil War ends differently, we have a different country. It wasn't just this is where I differ with Frank, who said a lot of smart things, but it is not the victory of ideas alone. The ideas need to be supported by, in our case, the people. And right, we are on a knife's edge. Now, do I think, by the way, that if Trump won and even drove the country toward dictatorship, that would mean the end of democracy in America? No. America's democratic traditions, I think, are too deep to completely disappear. So there's going to be a struggle. Even in ancient Athens, after Athens was a tyranny, after losing the war to Sparta, there was another democratic revolution led by Thrasybulus. I mean, I know you're all fascinated by Thrasybulus, but my father was fascinated by Thrasybulus. But anyway,
I was an undergraduate when your father was a history professor.
There you go. So, so I think, but I don't want to live through the intervening period. Okay, I'd rather skip. I'd like to let's just stay a democracy all the way through.
So, by the way, one of the insights of your book that I thought really captured something that struck me was basically you said, look, these anti-liberal forces, they were spread between the parties in the past. They had different levels of strength and weakness, but what is unique about this moment is that they are concentrated and have taken over one of the two political parties, and we're in a two-party system. Yeah. And can you speak about that?
Yeah, I mean, it was the case. The last time anti-liberal forces controlled a political party was the Democratic Party in the 19th century and somewhat into the 20th century, but mostly in the 19th century. After World War II and the great explosion of liberalism, both parties were headed fundamentally by liberal factions, and the anti-liberal factions were the minority in both of them. In the Republican Party, a weak minority. In the Democratic Party, until 1948, a strong minority. But then, over time, there was a national sorting that occurred. By the way, a similar national sorting occurred before the Civil War. When the two parties basically had to, the Whig Party exploded because it couldn't keep both factions inside of it. So gradually there's been a sorting where instead of having the South in the Democratic Party and white Protestant anti-liberal conservatism in the Republican Party, the South anti-liberals moved via George Wallace to the Republican Party, and then you had gradual, and by the way, Chris Caldwell wrote about this in the 1990s. He called it the Southern captivity of the Republican Party. So not only did you have the South moving its anti-liberalism into the Republican Party, but the more that was true, the more the liberals in the Republican Party began to leave the Republican Party and go over to the Democratic Party. So you really did have, as a result of this national sorting, all the anti-liberal forces in one party, and eventually their numbers, even though, it's been an interesting paradox because on the one hand, the percentage of white Americans has been shrinking as a proportion of the vote. Percentage, obviously, of Protestant Americans has shrunk according as a percentage of the vote. But in the Republican Party, they've grown. So shrinking in the country, growing in the Republican Party. And so you could say, and I do blame Republican leaders for allowing this to happen, but one of the reasons they allowed it to happen is because the numbers were there. And you had an increasingly highly motivated 25-35% of the vote, which, as we saw, has dominated the primaries and gives us someone like Donald Trump, and everybody else has had to adjust to that. The normal Republican politicians who were perfectly fine with Mitt Romney, et cetera, have had to adjust to the shifting demographic inside the party.
So, just a thought experiment. Let's say tomorrow Donald Trump said, I'm fed up with all this, I'm leaving public life, I'm going to devote the rest of my life to improving my golf game. Does all this, are we just still dealing with it with another person, or is it over?
Well, it's not over because obviously these forces still exist in the country and will always exist to some extent. But I do think there is nobody, I believe, you can't just pass the baton to another leader like Trump. I think Trump is special. I think the bond that he's created with these people is special. And I think it's more likely that the movement fragments and follows different leaders who are going to fight for its leadership. I also believe, by the way, that if Biden wins, that the Republican Party could split. I don't think there is a coherent party after a Trump loss, or as you say, him leaving the scene, which holds all the what we used to call normie Republicans together in this movement. I think it's more likely that the party would split, which would be a very healthy thing, I think, in the near term.
But you also said in your book that if Biden wins and Trump loses, we could face the prospect of national dissolution.
There's that too. Yeah,
so what would that look like?
Well, I'm just trying to, a lot of this is just play it out in a way that is true to what we can see. So let's just say what I think is fair. If Biden wins, we know Trump's going to declare fraud. He declares fraud in every election. He declared fraud in the 2016 election, which he won, because he said he got more of the popular vote than he was told. So he's going to declare fraud. Last time, the party kind of went like this and ultimately didn't really support him all the way, and certainly his vice president to support him. What will happen this time? I think the Republican leadership in both houses and in general, which is now completely, and the trial has proved it. By the way, I'm sorry, footnote, the trial has not convinced people that they should support Trump. The trial has revealed that people will support Trump no matter what. I just think I don't understand these news articles that say this is helping Trump. It's only identifying reality. But anyway, and that reality will persist to the point where after an election, so therefore I think the official Republican position will be that there was a fraudulent election. Okay, fine. It's an official position, but what are you doing about it? What do you do? I mean, and I think one thing that could happen, because this is the nature of our country and our system, is that Republican-dominated states with Republican governors and Republican legislatures could say, we don't accept the legitimacy of this election. We don't think that Joe Biden is the elected president. We think there was a fraud. Now, what happens then? I don't know. I could imagine 3 or 4 or 5 or maybe more states joining that coalition, and Trump would say, those are my states. I'm the president of those states. I mean, all these things are possible. Now, why do I say this? We haven't had a secession crisis in this country in a long time, although the South basically was basically sort of at least trying to nullify in the 1950s and early 60s, to the point where Dwight Eisenhower sent the 101st Airborne to Little Rock to enforce it. So, but we haven't had that kind of crisis. But secession is an option in America, even if it's unconstitutional, because at the end of the day, the American system is voluntary, and it's voluntary for the people, and I think the states always remember and have this option that the country was formed by the union of states coming together voluntarily, and while we can say you can't leave, the only way anyone's ever been stopped from leaving is by force or the threat of force. And so I just think we could be in a very interesting moment, because I don't think Joe Biden would want to use force. I'm not even sure he would want to use the federal government's capacity to punish states if they happen to be one of those states that gets more from the federal government than they give, etc. But I could see in a state the FBI being kicked out of its offices, federal offices in a state being told to get out, and tell Washington, what are you going to do about it? Because that is the way things have worked historically, except since the Civil War.
Let me open the floor now to questions, comments, thoughts. Yeah, Tony will go around with the mic to.
Hi there. I came in a couple minutes late, and so I may have missed it at the beginning. First of all, I want to say thank you. I think your ideas are really refreshing. Can we define liberalism? And in doing that, can we define, like, what's the nth degree of liberalism? What's the most extreme liberalism? And then kind of, if there is another end of the spectrum, what does that look like? Just to help me understand what we're talking about when we talk about liberalism.
I know, it's really a problem, obviously. But for me, liberalism is a very narrow thing, which is the protection of individual rights equally for all people. And what are those rights? They're spelled out in the Bill of Rights. The overarching principle is the principles of the Declaration. In my view, that liberalism does not tell you how much money the government should spend or how big the government should be. Jefferson and Hamilton had opposing economic programs. They both were trying to support liberalism in their own way. Hamilton was trying to support liberalism by getting buy-in from the wealthy and the industrious class. Jefferson was trying to get liberalism by strengthening what he called the yeoman farmer. But their goals were the same, they just had different. So when people say, well, it's liberal to spend a lot of money, or it's liberal to have a large administrative state, in my mind, call it something else. Call that progressive or what have you. because I don't think that liberalism tells you what economic policy to have. I don't think liberalism tells you what kind of foreign policy to have. We've had liberal presidents go to war at least as often, and argue probably more often, than so-called conservative presidents. So I don't want foreign policy to be part of it. I really do want to try to keep it at that level, because, as I say, the founder, and you get into questions of like property, which is one of the reasons that people are the left is not just the left, but people are disparaging of neoliberalism, which is what they call it. But that's like saying you don't like capitalism, and liberalism is not capitalism. I think that probably you can't have capitalism without liberalism, and it may be that you can't have liberalism without capitalism, but capitalism is not liberalism. And so I kind of want to take away both the excessive demands on liberalism and also an undervaluing of the liberalism I'm talking about. Because I think people got up, I have to say, academia is bored with my liberalism. They're not interested in individual rights. They're interested in solving economic problems and inequality and all that kind of stuff. And so to say, for instance, they don't like liberalism because it involves property rights. But I don't think the founders were fetishists about property. They knew there were going to be taxes, so they didn't say that everybody's money was their own, you couldn't touch it. They knew that there would be this struggle between the wealthy classes and the poorer classes over money. But that wasn't what they were concerned. They wanted that struggle to occur while people's rights were being defended as much as possible. And that's really what liberalism is. Liberalism does not solve your spiritual problems. It doesn't make you it doesn't give you a better life necessarily. It only protects you against having your rights violated, and by the way, chiefly by the government and the larger community. I think it was Judith Shklar who referred to it as the liberalism of fear, which is basically, by which she meant, what you want to know is the government can't come into your house and just do whatever it wants to you, which, by the way, is what the founders and the revolutionary generation's experience was with the British. We have to take seriously what happened to them, particularly in Boston. They had troops forced to live in their houses, they had their rights suspended. And so when they had a revolution, they said, that's not happening again. And so they spelled out specifically what rights needed to be protected. And now it's like, as I say, we're bored of that. But to me, that is what's at risk in the world today, is that liberalism that protects us from the government, that protects us from each other. And that is, I think, what's at stake now.
Hi, thanks very much. Just a comment and a question. My comment is that it seems to me that economic disenfranchisement played a very big role in grievance that led to the support of Donald Trump. That I accept what you were saying about racism, but it seems that that was an important factor. My question is more, you have lots of friends in the traditional conservative movement, in the political class, and I guess I just am confused when I see people who I know who have promoted a liberal idea and have fought against fascism for their entire political careers. And I think you've laid out a number of different explanations for that. Physical fear, fear of being primaried by people who are more conservative. But I also seem to think that there's a certain group in the Republican Party who think that they need the Trump voters for their support to be a national party. And that Trump does bring out voters who otherwise might not vote at all because they do see him as a symbol for the various different problems that they're facing in their lives. So I just wanted to hear you say a little bit more about why a Republican Party that has always opposed fascism seemed to be accepting it within the domestic context.
Well, it's a good question, but I have to say, the Republican Party has not always opposed fascism. The Republican Party was sort of vaguely pro-fascist in the 1930s and 20s. And by the way, there were particular people in the Trump orbit who say specifically that they want to go back to the 1920s. So I think we shouldn't underestimate the degree to which the Republican Party has always been, not always, but it's in the DNA, put it that way. And again, it's right, because if you're anti-liberal fundamentally, then you don't have as big a problem with fascism as other people. I don't know whether you were asking me a question about the economic hardships or not, but the only thing I would say is, if you think that this movement is similar to past movements, and I think it is, because when I go back and I read, Richard Hofstadter or Daniel Bell, people like that writing about the McCarthy movement and the John Birch Society, I couldn't believe how much they sounded like what we are talking about today. You could almost lift the language and be talking about today. And the fact is, many of those movements arose during times of economic prosperity. The Klan, which exploded in the 1920s and became almost a respectable civic institution despite its racism and anti-Catholicism and anti-Semitism, the 1920s were a boom period, and the Klan was not speaking for the disenfranchised. And if you look at the Trump voter, he's equally supported in every group. He and Hillary Clinton had the same number for people earning above 100,000. That Hillary Clinton had more of the poor supporting her. And I really think that, I'm sorry, I just think that and finally, if you have an economic problem, explain to me why Trump is the answer to that economic problem, So I understand that, and I know inequality is a big issue for everybody, et cetera. Inequality is an issue, but I just think when we go in that direction, and I'm not saying that you're saying this, but I worry sometimes that, we're sort of infantilizing half the country, because what we're saying is, as I said earlier, if we give you a little money, you'll feel better, right? And then you'll leave this alone. And I just don't think that's the case. I think they have really deep beliefs about what they think is wrong with our society, and it ain't economic. So I feel like it's a bit of a red herring, which distracts us from the fact that we are engaged in a fundamental ideological battle. And it is an ideological battle about what is the nature of this country.
Thank you so much. I was wondering what separates anti-liberalism from fascism. What is that in between that makes it possible to talk about anti-liberals and not automatically talking about fascists?
Antiliberalism and nationalism, or antiliberal and fascism? Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that fascism is the anti-liberal answer in a popular age. I guess that's what I'm saying. When you go back and read read Mussolini's speeches and statements, he was very open about saying, I am leading an anti-liberal campaign. I am against the liberals. I am against the liberal democracies. I am the alternative to that. And I think that, we have a tendency to treat fascism as if it's sui generis, whether it's Hitler or Mussolini, or that it's somehow peculiar to the European situation. But I think we just need to understand that fascism in many respects is just the anti-liberal, is the modern anti-liberal alternative. The anti-liberal alternative in the 19th century was absolute monarchy. That's what Metternich and Alexander and all those people stood for. That's what Demetre was for, because that was the alternative at the time to liberalism. But today, the alternative to liberalism is fascism. This lady's had her hand up for so long. Right here.
I don't even know where to begin except to thank you, because everything you said was correct. There have been first of all, we're dealing with a minority of people in this country, not just eligible voters, but in general, that have elected, because of our peculiarities in our voting system, Donald Trump. It continues to be manipulated. But there were so many times along the way when he could have been stopped. For example, Mitch McConnell could have found his testicles and encouraged a couple more senators to impeach him. He didn't. Now, you two are members of the Federalist Society, and we're looking at the highest court in our land, the Supreme Court, right now. You talk about this minor case. There are major cases pending. And what is the Supreme Court doing about the most major case? They are tying it up. when it is very obvious that no president who's a criminal should get immunity. And yet you've got Thomas and Alito. I wonder how is there's got to be a split in the Federalist Society, just like there is in the Catholic Church and in other conservative institutions. I mean, the highest court in the land is basically enabling the election of Donald Trump, and it's more than disturbing.
Well, I will say this. In fairness to the Federalist Society, I am not a member anymore, and so I can't really speak to that. But I will say this. You know, look, I filed a brief in the immunity case saying I didn't see any basis in the law anywhere for any of this immunity. But I will say this about the court. In virtually every instance when they have had an opportunity to rule on something that has affected Donald Trump's personal interests, they have ruled against him. He is bitterly disappointed with this court. They resisted every importuning on his part to get involved in the 2020 election. They denied all of those petitions. They sided against him when, you know, the New York DA wanted his tax returns. The only instance in which this court has ruled in favor of Donald Trump's personal interests was when it unanimously ruled this year against the ballot disqualification efforts. So I still believe that the court is in a position to, you know, be a good court with respect to the anti-liberalism and anti-democratic tendencies of Donald Trump. But look, only time will tell.
Thank you.
I'm not going to contradict my betters here.
So I have a quick question. I work a lot with young people, and it seems like they are more tolerant of people that are different from them. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's my experience, okay? So I'm curious what your experience is and how that plays into your thinking about, like the scenario you outlined to me seemed like make complete sense, but more for people 35 and up. For those 15 to 35 and how they engage in the world and in the United States, it's their future. What do you think, what are your observations from their perspective about what you shared? That may not be clear, but I'm curious what you think.
Well, the one thing you said is totally true, which is that, and you know, this is my kids who, you know, went to public school in the area, and they're so much more open. But that's here. I'm not sure that's true everywhere, and I think what it seems to me pretty obvious is that even the youth is breaking down in a similar fashion to the rest of the population, and for similar reasons. And, you know, if you look at, this is actually something my son is an expert on, but if you look at polling of the young men coming out of college versus the young women, there's a huge gap. And I think, you know, again, based on experiences that I've seen, the male experience in college is not one that is conducive to what you're talking about. And many come out and look at, you know, you should look at what their feeds are and look at who these various right-wing talk podcast people, they've got this massive young men's following. And young white men, if let's be honest. So I'm not as, and polls also are not quite what we would expect, I think, if you were right. And so I think the problem is there's no reason to assume that the younger generation is escaping this malady any better than anybody else is. So I would love to say, you know, what is the line? The future are our children. The children are our future. I could sing whatever Whitney Houston song there is, but I'm not sure they are, actually.
Thank you very much. She spoke about a minority of the people and their voice in our system, which raises this issue, and I apologize if this is getting too far afield from the book, but I think we're the only country where the president can be elected by a minority of the people. In terms of you get less votes than the other candidate, and you can still win. And then we have terrible turnout. I was an election observer in the Philippines, and it was amazing. It's over 80% of the people, in which you can say that's a corrupt system, but 80% of the people voted. What, in your view, can be done to change our mentality, our ethos about the vote and how important voting is to the future of our country?
I'm not going to come up with some answer that answers your question. I don't know what to do. I mean, and also I've talked to people. There's a lot of we need more civic education. Obviously, I could say all the things that people say. None of that is going to solve the problem that we face in 2024. We're not going to reform everything. We're not going to re-educate our population, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm interested in that topic in a general matter, but it's not going to save us. And honestly, since my belief is if we can get past, I'd love to talk about reforms after the election. For one thing, I didn't know whether, I thought maybe you were kind of hinting at the Electoral College issue, but I noticed you didn't totally go there. But just on the Electoral College, I don't know what to do about voting. I mean, people, it's a free country. They don't have to vote if they don't want to, But the Electoral College is an interesting thing. Obviously, it favors the sparsely populated areas and the rural areas in a way that is, and it was originally created not primarily, but certainly partially for a slave state, protection. But I don't want to have a constitutional convention in our present state, okay? I don't want to open up the Constitution at this point. B, there are different times when the Electoral College has favored the Democratic Party. It doesn't necessarily have to favor one party or another. It's more the peculiarity of rural distribution. And I do think that if it's worth just, again, thinking about the fact that if we didn't have the Electoral College, presidential candidates would ignore I don't know how many states. They just would never go to them. They would spend all their time in New York and California and Texas and Florida, and they'd never go to these other states. And we still do have a federal system. We don't want states to be ignored, so I wouldn't be too blithe about getting rid of the Electoral College, even though obviously right now it's a big problem.
Hey, Dr. Kagan, what are your thoughts about religion and our democracy? Do you think that's an important feature kind of undergirding the democracy? And do you think to some extent there needs to be some vestige of Judeo-Christian values to make things work as they've worked, or do you think that's not needed?
Is that the last question? That's a really... Look, I mean, let's just talk about the founders for a second. The founders obviously lived in a religious society, and I think they probably assumed that religion would provide some of the things that, as I was saying earlier, liberalism doesn't provide. On the other hand, they were really, really wanted to make sure religion played no role in the government. So they, and I think that there's no question that liberalism can have a corrosive effect on religion as a dominant force in society. And I would love to, say that more religion was the answer, but right now more religion is also the problem, because part of the problem is that a significant number of Trump supporters would believe that the United States should be a Christian country, even believe that the founders created a Christian country, which was not true. And so I will tell you that Jefferson certainly thought religion tended to be antithetical to liberalism. And I understand why he said that. So no, I don't think religion is the answer to our problems. I think that what liberalism does do, which is fine, is everybody can worship the way they want to worship. There were alternatives. The French Revolution tried to wipe out religion altogether. They were killing priests. The Spanish Revolution killed priests. The Bolsheviks destroyed the church. That was never the American answer. It was just, you can't take your views and impose them on everybody else. But unfortunately, that is precisely what people want to do today. That's precisely what the Christian nationalists want to do. That's precisely what Josh Hawley wants to do. And when Josh Hawley says America is a revolutionary country because of the revolution that occurred in Israel 2,000 years ago, that is an anti-liberal statement, because that is not the revolution that is relevant to our life. And I know that that's not where you were going, but I used to be more sympathetic to the idea, and I remember I grew up with neoconservatives of various stripes who themselves were, I would say, probably atheists or borderline, but thought that it was a good idea to have religion out there for the people. I am less persuaded that that has turned out to be true.
I've gotten the signal we have time for one more question, I think.
Thank you. You haven't talked much about, or you haven't talked about technology and the role it plays in feeding anti-liberalism. So Jamie Dimon is a real disappointment, really a disappointment, because we'd like to think he knows better. In fact, we know he knows better. And his blasé attitude is really disturbing. But now we're reading in the press that we have a group of amoral people out in California throwing a huge fundraiser for Trump, the techie bros. And, you know, it's really disturbing because these are the people who operate and own the means of information. If you go back to someone like Jacques Ellul, who wrote one of the best little books about propaganda, how do you start a coup? You take over the ways people get their information. So I'm just curious, who do you think's courting who? Is Trump courting them, or they are courting him?
Well, in that case, I'm not sure that the fact that they're tech people is the key factor. The money is going toward Trump, period. And by the way, even if you don't, if you're a businessman and you're or a rich person, you're going to hedge your bet. The guy may be president next year, so you're buying in now. You know, don't buy in too late. He keeps track. That's why you're seeing all this money pouring into him now, because he may be president. And what am I going to do? Get my company ostracized in the next administration? So, in that case. However, but you raised a different question, which I think is really important, and I have to admit, I don't even know what the answer is. It seems to me obvious that social media is a pernicious, has had a pernicious effect on our society in many ways. I'm guessing that, like many of these things, we will learn how to deal with it better, all things being equal, if we get to that point. You know, that people, I'm sure that there's going to be increasing movements insofar as it's humanly possible, and it may not be humanly possible, to try to disengage a little bit, but maybe I'm wrong. There's no question about the pernicious effect, but I also don't know what to do about it. I mean, we're not going to shut it down. We're not going to deprive it, say you can't own this company, et cetera, because we don't like what you're doing with it. I mean, I think we should be regulating this business much more than we are. The Europeans are way ahead of us on this. And I think that, you know, there's no reason in the world why these organizations can't be more regulated. But you can count. But in answer to your question, you can count on everybody in any sector at this point to be trying to line Donald Trump's pockets in the hope of being well treated when he's president. Because you're not going to be punished by the Biden administration if he wins, right?
Please join me in thanking Bob for what was a terrific, brilliant, bracing talk. And I assume the book is available? No?
On Amazon.
On Amazon it is available. There is a reception. Yes, I got that one right. Thank you all for coming, and thanks most of all to Bob. Thanks so much.